I buried 14 people before breakfast that Tuesday morning, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, I'd already washed the clay from under my fingernails twice. That was my routine. 6 months of it. I'd become the kind of man who could eat a cold biscuit with hands that had just tamped dirt over someone's chest and not think about it until the middle of the night, when the thinking came whether you wanted it or not. My name is Elliot Vars. Before the outbreak, I installed residential gutters in Braddock County, Virginia. I drove a white van with a magnetic sign that read Vars and Son, even though my son had never worked a day of the business, and the name was aspirational at best. Now I dug graves for a settlement of 53 people camped inside the perimeter of a decommissioned state forestry station on a bald ridge 1,100 feet above the Shenandoah Valley. I was the gravedigger because I'd volunteered during the first week when nobody else would touch the dead, and nobody had relieved me since. The camp called itself Ridgeline. Not officially. There was no charter, no elected council, no letterhead. Just a name someone spray-painted on the welcome sign the Forestry Service had left behind. Ridgeline occupied 3 cinder block buildings, the old ranger office, a vehicle bay converted to a dining hall, and a storage shed that served as our medical clinic. Around these, we'd strung a double fence of cattle panel and razor wire scavenged from a correction supply warehouse 14 miles south. Inside the wire, 53 people slept, argued, rationed, mourned, and maintained a silence discipline so strict that I sometimes forgot what my own speaking voice sounded like above a whisper. The silence was Councilwoman Dara Kessling's rule. Dara was 51, former County Emergency Management Coordinator, and the closest thing Ridgeline had to an executive authority. She hadn't been elected either. She'd simply arrived during the second week with a binder of laminated protocol sheets, a functioning hand-crank radio, and the organizational will of a woman who had spent 20 years writing disaster plans nobody read. People listened to her because she was the only one who acted as if she'd expected the world to end and had brought the paperwork. Dara's logic was airtight. The infected tracked sound over distance. A shout carried a quarter mile on still air. A gunshot further. A generator further still. So Ridgeline ran dark after sundown and silent around the clock. We cooked on wood coals and buried fire pits. We communicated with hand signals adapted from a Boy Scout manual someone found in the ranger office desk. We did not sing, did not argue above a whisper, did not clap, did not cry out. When we stumbled in the dark, or burned ourselves on a cookpot, the only mechanical noise permitted was the hand-crank radio. Operated once daily at noon inside the vehicle bay, with the steel doors shut. It worked. 6 months without a perimeter breach. 6 months without a horde. The dead wandered the valley below us in loose clusters of 3 and 5, visible some mornings from the overlook like slow gray deer moving through the fog, but they never climbed. Dara said it was the elevation. Marcus Healy, our nearest thing to a medic, a veterinary technician from Luray, said it was the temperature differential, that the infected lost coordination in cold air. Nobody knew for certain. We were alive, and being alive had become its own sufficient theory. I kept the graveyard on the north slope, just beyond the second fence, in a clearing I'd widened by hand with a brush axe. 31 plots in 6 months. Most were illness. Pneumonia, untreated infection, 1 burst appendix. A few were injuries from scavenging runs gone wrong. 2 were suicides. 1 was a man named Gerald Fenn, who'd walked to the overlook on a clear November night, looked down at the valley, and stepped off without a word. I'd found him at the base the next morning. I dug his grave in frozen ground, and did not discuss it, and nobody asked me to. I am telling you this because you need to understand what Ridgeline was before the crying started. It was a place that had perfected the arithmetic of not dying. And then a baby came. The mother's name was Yolanda Reese, 26 years old, formerly an assistant manager at a Culpeper Target. And she'd walked into Ridgeline on day 19 with an older woman named Francine, who turned out to be no relation at all, just someone she'd found in a parking garage stairwell. Yolanda was quiet, cooperative, strong for her size. She pulled fence repair shifts without complaint. She sorted salvage. She never violated the silence discipline, not once. She was also 5 weeks pregnant when she arrived, and she told no one. I don't know how she concealed it as long as she did. Loose clothing, deliberate layer strategy. The fact that we were all losing weight and nobody examined anyone too closely below the neck. Marcus Healy noticed at month 4. He told Dara. Dara told no one. I learned this afterward. The two of them had a private conference in the ranger office, the only private room in camp, and emerged with identical expressions of practiced calm. They began quietly diverting additional food toward Yolanda's plate. A second blanket appeared on her cot. Marcus started visiting her bunk every third day with a stethoscope he'd sterilized in boiling water. The rest of us found out the way you find out anything in a camp of 53 people living shoulder to shoulder in concrete rooms. Someone saw her belly at the wash basin. Within 2 days, everyone knew. Nobody said a word. Not because they were calm, because they were terrified. A baby cries. That was the sentence I heard whispered more times than any other in those last weeks of Yolanda's pregnancy. Curtis Lamb, who ran our scavenging logistics, said it in the dining hall to anyone who'd listen. A baby cries. It doesn't understand silence. It cannot be taught. It cannot be negotiated with. It will broadcast our position to every dead thing in the valley. And then this place dies too. Curtis wasn't wrong. That was the problem. Curtis was almost never wrong. He was a former freight company dispatcher, 44, lean and meticulous. And he'd kept our salvage runs organized with a discipline that had measurably kept people alive. He tracked fuel by the ounce. He mapped safe corridors by time of day and wind direction. He maintained a ledger of caloric intake per person per day that he updated every evening in a hand the size of a needle scratch. When Curtis said a thing was unsustainable, people listened, because his ledger had been right about the November ration crisis and right about the South Road closure and right about Gerald Fenn being a risk before Gerald Fenn walked off the overlook. Now Curtis was doing math on the baby. Not cruelty, arithmetic. He calculated the decibel output of an infant cry. He estimated the nighttime carry distance given Ridgeline's elevation and typical wind. He cross-referenced it with his horde density estimates for the valley floor. He presented his findings to Dara in a one-page memo written on the back of a Forestry Service form. I know this because Dara showed it to me. She came to the graveyard on a Thursday afternoon while I was shaping the edge of Plot 32, Mrs. Pock, 67, kidney failure, and she sat on the stack of salvaged fence posts I used as a bench and held the paper in both hands. He wants a vote, Dara said. On what? On whether the baby stays. I stopped digging. Where else would it go? Dara folded the paper. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Curtis wasn't proposing exile. He was proposing that Yolanda be moved outside the perimeter before delivery, with supplies, to a secondary location he'd already identified an intact cabin 4 miles south. Far enough that a crying infant wouldn't register. Close enough, in theory, for occasional supply runs. He has 11 signatures, Dara said, out of 53. Out of 53. But the 11 include both Gatewatch leads and the South Road scavenging team. The people with guns. She didn't say that either. She didn't need to. I put the shovel down and looked at the 31 crosses behind me, each one cut from a single oak plank, each one with a name burned into the grain with a soldering iron I'd found in the shed. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "I need you to think about what kind of place buries its dead with names on them," she said, "and then puts a pregnant woman outside the fence." The camp fractured, and it fractured quietly, which was the worst way a thing could break. There was no argument. There was no shouting. Ridgeline didn't shout. It whispered, and the whispers divided us more cleanly than any scream could have. Curtis's faction, I'll call them that, though Curtis himself would have rejected the word numbered 11, then 15, then by the end of the week, 19. They weren't monsters. I need to say that clearly because what happened later will make it easy to flatten them into villains. And they weren't. They were people who had survived by following rules. And the rules said, silence keeps us alive. A baby destroys silence. Therefore, the baby cannot be here. The logic was immaculate. It was also, I came to believe, precisely the kind of thinking that kills you by degrees, while convincing you that you're being saved. Dara's side didn't organize. That was the difference. Curtis had a memo, a signature list, a proposed relocation plan, with supply calculations and a communication schedule. Dara had a principle she couldn't articulate past the feeling that exile was wrong. She stood in the dining hall one evening after the meal, whispering, always whispering, and said only that Ridgeline had not yet put a living person outside the wire, and she would not begin with a woman and her unborn child. Marcus Healy stood with Dara, but his reasons were medical. Yolanda's blood pressure was elevated. He suspected preeclampsia based on ankle swelling and persistent headaches he'd been monitoring. Delivering in a remote cabin with no assistance, no sterile supplies, no backup, was not relocation. It was a death sentence delivered in the language of logistics. "I can't do a cesarean with a Swiss Army knife and a headlamp," Marcus said. And the room went silent. Curtis's response, delivered the next morning via another written memo, slipped under Dara's door, was that Marcus could accompany Yolanda to the cabin. Problem solved. Marcus refused. He was Ridgeline's only medical provider. Leaving 51 people without care to attend one delivery was its own arithmetic, and Curtis's own logic condemned it. This was how the days passed. Memo and counter-memo. Whispered hallway arguments that stopped when a third person approached. People choosing which table to sit at during meals. The dining hall developing a geography of allegiance as legible as a seating chart. Yolanda sat with Francine at a table near the kitchen pass-through. And around her a buffer zone grew. An empty chair on each side that neither faction filled because sitting next to her was a declaration, and everyone was still pretending declarations hadn't started. I sat with Yolanda. Not out of political conviction, but because I'd been sitting there since week 3 and I wasn't going to be rearranged by a man with a clipboard. Francine nodded at me each morning. Yolanda said nothing. She ate her double portion Marcus's orders with her eyes on her plate and her hand occasionally moving to her belly in a gesture so private that looking at it felt like reading someone's diary. On the 9th day of the schism, I was digging plot 33. Arthur Briggs, 59. Cardiac event during a fence repair. I was 3 feet down when I stopped and leaned on the handle and counted. 33 graves, 53 living. I counted again. I walked the rows. I'd been keeping a ledger of my own, not caloric intake or decibel estimates, but names and dates. Scratched into the inside cover of a Gideon Bible I'd taken from the ranger office desk. 33 names. Some I'd buried myself. Some had died before I arrived, and I'd only carved the crosses from descriptions others gave me. 33 dead, 53 living. In 6 months, Ridgeline had lost nearly 40% of its peak population. We were not growing. We were not stable. We were in a managed decline so orderly that it looked like survival. Curtis's math said the baby was a threat. My math said the baby was the only evidence we were still a living settlement and not a mausoleum with a meal schedule. I didn't know how to make that argument in a memo. I didn't know how to write it in a way that competed with decibel calculations and horde density projections. But I knew it in my hands, in the calluses and the clay, in the 33 holes I had personally opened in the earth. I finished Arthur Briggs's grave. I carved his cross. And then I walked to the ranger office and told Dara I wanted to speak at the next camp meeting. The meeting was held on a Sunday evening inside the vehicle bay with the steel doors closed. This was protocol for any gathering that might produce elevated voices. The bay was the most acoustically sealed structure in camp. A concrete box with 16-inch walls originally designed to muffle diesel engines. 47 people attended. 6 were on perimeter watch. Yolanda was not present. Marcus had confined her to bed rest that afternoon after her blood pressure reading alarmed him in a way he didn't fully explain. Dara opened by stating facts. Yolanda was approximately 36 weeks. Delivery was expected within the month. A decision was required. She then yielded the floor, a phrase that felt absurdly parliamentary, given that the floor was oil-stained concrete and the parliament was a circle of folding chairs occupied by people in unwashed clothing. Curtis spoke first. He was measured. He'd always been measured. He stood with his ledger held closed at his side, never opened it, never referenced a number, which told me he'd memorized everything, and laid out his proposal with the calm of a man presenting a quarterly budget, the cabin, the supply cache, the escort detail, the communication schedule. He'd even calculated a timeline. Yolanda would return to Ridgeline once the child was old enough to understand and obey the silence discipline. 18 months, he estimated. Perhaps 24. No one is being expelled, Curtis said. No one is being punished. We are adapting our protocols to accommodate a new variable without compromising the security framework that has kept every person in this room alive. He sat down. Several people nodded. The nods were small and furtive, the way people agree when they suspect agreement costs something. I stood up. I'd never spoken at a camp meeting before. I had attended every one, sitting in the back row with my mud-caked boots and my Bible ledger, and I had never raised my hand. The gravedigger didn't speak. The gravedigger dug. I want to read some names, I said. Dara looked at me. Curtis looked at me. 45 other faces turned. I opened the Bible to the inside cover. Margaret Alford. Day 8, pneumonia. Samuel Ochoa. Day 12, infection from a compound fracture. Denise Yun. Day 19. I read all 33. I read them slowly. I read the cause of death after each name where I knew it. The list took 4 minutes. The bay was silent in a way that was different from our enforced silence. It was the silence of people hearing something they'd chosen not to count. When I finished, I closed the book. 33 dead in 6 months, I said. At this rate, Ridgeline will be empty in 2 years. Not from a breach, not from a horde, from pneumonia, from infection, from hearts that stop and appendixes that burst and people who walk off the overlook because they can't find a reason to stay. Curtis shifted in his chair. That's not a response to the security concern. It's the only response, I said. You're calculating how a baby threatens us. I'm telling you, we're already dying. The only question is whether we die quiet and organized or whether something changes. Sentiment isn't strategy, Elliot. Neither is digging a grave every 9 days. The room shifted. Not dramatically. A few people uncrossed their arms. A woman named Bev Tanaka, who'd been sitting on Curtis's side of the bay, leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and looked at the floor. Then a voice I didn't expect. Francine. She'd been sitting against the wall, not in the circle, her arms folded over her chest. Francine was 63, barely spoke, and had survived to Ridgeline by hiding inside a dumpster for 2 days. She didn't raise her hand. She just talked. I was a NICU nurse for 27 years, she said. Before I was a woman Yolanda found in a stairwell. No one here asked me what I did before. You assumed I was another mouth. I can deliver that baby. I can manage complications, Marcus can't. And I can tell you that infant sound reduction techniques exist and have been practiced in conflict zones and refugee camps for decades. Swaddling, immediate feeding response, skin-to-skin regulation. You don't silence a newborn. You answer it before it has to scream. The room recalibrated. I watched it happen in real time. Francine, the silent appendage, becoming the most important person in the settlement. Curtis stared at her for a long moment, then said, "What's the failure rate?" Francine met his eyes. Lower than exile. The vote was 29-18. The baby would stay. Curtis accepted the result. I'll give him that. He folded his memo, put it in his back pocket, and returned to his bunk without a word. The next morning, he was at the gate at his regular hour, organizing the Tuesday scavenging run with his usual precision. He didn't sulk. He didn't sabotage. He simply recalculated. Within 2 days, he'd produced a new memo. If the baby stayed, the camp needed acoustic countermeasures. He proposed padded walls in the sleeping quarters. A designated nursing room in the innermost section of the ranger office. A white noise protocol using wind-activated noisemakers placed at intervals along the perimeter to mask incidental sound beneath ambient environmental clutter. It was brilliant, actually. The same mind that had argued for exile now engineered accommodation with identical rigor. Some people called it a reversal. I called it Curtis. The conclusion changed. The method didn't. Dara approved every proposal. Construction began immediately. We stripped insulation from the vehicle bay ceiling and packed it between plywood sheets to create a padded interior room, the quiet room, someone named it. And the name stuck. Marcus inventoried his remaining medical supplies and presented Francine with a delivery kit that included clean towels, a sterilized razor blade, 2 pairs of latex gloves, a bulb syringe, and a half bottle of isopropyl alcohol. Francine examined each item, set aside the razor blade, and asked instead for unwaxed dental floss and a pair of hemostats from the veterinary kit. For the cord, she said when Marcus looked confused. I know what it's for. I've clamped 100 umbilical cords. On calves. Then you'll assist. Francine was not asking. Marcus agreed. The unlikely pairing, the veterinary technician and the retired NICU nurse, began holding preparation sessions in the quiet room each evening, rehearsing scenarios in whispered clinical shorthand that I could hear through the wall when I passed on my way to wash my hands. Yolanda, through all of this, maintained her silence. She attended no meetings. She made no statements. She continued to eat her meals at the same table, continued to rest as Marcus directed, continued to place her hand on her belly in that gesture that was prayer and measurement and private conversation all at once. I brought her water one afternoon, the good water, from the spring we'd tapped behind the north slope, not the iodine-treated creek water, and she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't catalog. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to the look of a person holding a secret they hadn't chosen to carry. "Thank you, Elliot," she said. First time she'd ever used my name. The camp, meanwhile, did something I had not anticipated. It changed temperature. Not politically, the vote had settled the political question, but emotionally. The preparation work gave people a project that wasn't defense or rationing or burial. For the first time in 6 months, people were building something forward-facing. Bev Tanaka, who worked leather salvage, stitched a pair of infant booties from a scrap of deerskin. Someone carved a rattle from a piece of birch. A woman named Delia Marsh, who rarely spoke to anyone, appeared one morning with a knitted cap she'd made from unraveled sweater yarn, sized for a head that didn't exist yet. These objects accumulated on a shelf in the quiet room. Nobody organized them. Nobody announced them. They simply appeared, one by one, offerings laid at a threshold. Curtis noted the phenomenon without comment. I saw him look at the shelf once during an inspection of the acoustic padding, and his expression was unreadable. He picked up the knitted cap, turned it over in his hands, set it back down, and resumed measuring sound absorption with a stopwatch and a clapped book. But something else was happening too. Something I noticed, because my work took me outside the wire every day, while most people stayed in. The valley was changing. The clusters of dead I'd watched from the overlook for months. The slow gray shapes in the morning fog were consolidating. Where I'd once counted groups of 3 and 5, I now counted groups of 12 and 20. They moved differently too, less random, more directional, trending north, trending uphill. I told Dara. She told Marcus. Marcus said the temperature theory was holding the infected, moved more slowly and cold, but acknowledged the behavioral shift. Maybe seasonal, he said. Migration patterns. We don't know enough. We know they're closer than they were. Marcus nodded. He didn't argue. That was the thing about Marcus. He never lied to you by optimism. I went back to the graveyard and sharpened my shovel and tried not to count the weeks. Plot 34 was a girl named Erin Varela, 19, who died of a tooth abscess that became septic because we had no antibiotics left. I buried her on a Wednesday. Marcus stood at the graveside and didn't say anything medical. He just stood there. When I finished tamping the dirt, he helped me carry the cross and hold it while I drove the base. Francine says the baby's turned, Marcus said. Head down, could be any day. Is that good? It's normal. Normal is good. Normal is the entire range of what I'm hoping for. I pounded the last steak and stepped back. Erin Varela, 19 years old. She'd been a biology major at JMU before the outbreak. She'd told me once that she wanted to study marine mammals. I hadn't known what to say to that, so I'd said something about whales. And she'd laughed. And that was the only time I'd heard her laugh. The dead in the valley were closer. I could see them from the graveyard now, without walking to the overlook. A line of figures at the tree line, maybe 200 yards below the north slope. Standing in that awful, patient stillness that was worse than movement. 12 of them, facing uphill. Not climbing, just facing. I reported it to Dara that evening. She called an emergency meeting in the vehicle bay, the 4th in 2 weeks, more than Ridgeline had convened in any prior month. Curtis attended with his ledger and a new document, a tactical withdrawal plan. If the perimeter is breached, we fall back to the vehicle bay, he said. It's the most defensible structure. Concrete walls, steel doors, one entrance. We barricade and hold. Hold for how long? Someone asked. As long as necessary. Necessary for what? Curtis didn't answer that. There was no answer. Holding was its own verb at Ridgeline, transitive to nothing. Dara assigned double watches on the north slope. She redistributed the camp's weapons: 4 rifles, 2 shotguns, 11 assorted handguns, and a collection of bladed tools that included my brush axe to rotating armed patrols. This violated her own noise discipline in principle, since any firearm use would shatter the silence that protected us. But the alternative was allowing the dead to walk through an unguarded fence. The paradox was not lost on anyone. Our defense required the very noise that would summon what we were defending against. If we fired a single shot, we announced ourselves to every infected thing within earshot. If we didn't fire, we died quietly. I took the north slope watch that night, midnight to 4. The November air cut through my jacket, and I sat on a rock 10 feet inside the outer fence, with a brush axe across my knees, and watched the tree line through a pair of binoculars we'd salvaged from the ranger office. The 12 figures were still there. They hadn't moved. I could see their outlines against the slightly lighter dark of the open slope below. At 2:15, one of them moved. Not toward us. Sideways. A slow lateral drift to the east, then a stop. Then another moved. Same direction, same stop. Like pieces being repositioned on a board by an invisible hand. I watched this for an hour. The group spread itself across a wider frontage, each figure finding a position and holding it. By 3 in the morning, they were arrayed in a rough arc across the north slope, evenly spaced, facing uphill. Not a cluster, a line. I woke Dara at 4. She came to the fence in her boots and long coat and looked through the binoculars without speaking for a full minute. "They're not wandering," she said. "No, they're waiting." We stood in the dark and watched the dead watch us, and neither of us said the word that was forming independently in both our heads. Siege. And below us, inside the ranger office, inside the padded quiet room, Yolanda Reese slept with her hands on a belly that was running out of time. Labor began at 4:17 on a Tuesday morning, 2 days after the tree line count had risen from 12 to 31. I was in the graveyard sharpening the brush axe by feel in the dark when Francine's shape appeared at the fence gate. And even before she spoke, I knew. Because Francine never left the ranger office at that hour. "It's starting," she whispered. I followed her inside. Marcus was already in the quiet room. Yolanda was on the cot, knees drawn up, breathing in a controlled pattern that Francine had taught her over the past 2 weeks: nasal inhalation, slow oral exhalation, a rhythm designed to manage pain without vocalization. The padded walls absorbed what sound there was. A single battery lantern threw a yellow circle on the ceiling. I had no business being there. I was the gravedigger. But Francine had asked me to be available outside the door in case she needed something carried or someone held down. And so I sat in the hallway with my back against the wall and listened to the sounds of a woman trying to bring a life into the world without making a noise. The camp woke in stages. Dara was the first to appear, still buttoning her coat. Then Bev Tanaka. Then Curtis, who stood at the far end of the hallway with his arms crossed and his face illuminated by the red glow of the exit sign someone had wired to a car battery months ago. He said nothing. He just stood. By 5:30, the hallway was full. People sat along both walls, knees to chest, quiet, awake. Nobody had been summoned. Nobody needed to be. The knowledge moved through the camp the way weather moves through a valley, a pressure change that everyone felt before anyone could name it. Inside the quiet room, Yolanda's breathing changed. The intervals shortened. I heard Francine's voice, low and steady, coaching. Then Marcus's voice, clinical, calling out numbers I didn't understand, centimeters, probably, or heart rates. Then a sound that made every person in the hallway go rigid. A low moan, involuntary, pulled from somewhere below language. I watched Curtis's face. He closed his eyes, not in anger, in calculation. I could see him estimating the decibel level, the wall absorption, the distance to the perimeter, the distance to the tree line. His lips moved slightly, doing math even now. The moan subsided. Francine whispered something. Then silence. Then another sound, louder. A gasp that broke into a truncated cry. Yolanda clamped it shut midway through, and I heard the effort of that suppression, like a physical thing. A door slammed against a flood. The woman beside me. Delia Marsh. The knitter reached over and gripped my forearm. Her hand was shaking, not from fear, from something older and less nameable. I put my hand over hers and held it. At 6:12, Marcus opened the door. His surgical gloves were bloody. His face was doing something I'd never seen on Marcus Healy's face before, a kind of controlled wonder that looked almost like pain. "She needs to push," he said. "Francine says it's time, but she can't push without noise." "How much noise?" Dara asked from the hallway. Marcus looked at her. "Enough." Dara closed her eyes. She was calculating too. Everyone at Ridgeline calculated. That was what 6 months of managed silence had made us, a community of involuntary mathematicians, running threat models in our sleep. "Do it," Dara said. Marcus went back inside. The door closed. And for 23 minutes, Yolanda Reese pushed a child into the world. And the sounds she made were the sounds of every woman who had ever given birth in every age of the world, regardless of what waited outside the walls. At 6:35, a different sound. Not Yolanda's, a new frequency. Thin, sharp, bewildered, utterly uncontrolled. The baby was crying. Nobody in the hallway breathed. The cry did not stop. Francine was doing everything right. I learned this later. Immediate skin-to-skin contact. A guide toward the breast. Gentle vertical hold. Mouth near the sternum for vibration, soothing. Techniques practiced for decades in NICU wards and refugee tents and war zones where silence was life. But the child was minutes old, and it had lungs, and it had been compressed through a canal and thrust into cold air and light. And it did the only thing a human being does when it arrives in a world it never asked for. It announced itself. The sound went through the padded walls like the padding wasn't there. It went through the hallway door. It reached every person sitting along those concrete walls, and I watched each face change, not in fear, not yet, but in a recognition so deep it preceded thought. They had all been born once. They had all made this sound. It was the foundational human broadcast, and it cut through 6 months of silence discipline like a blade through gauze. Curtis moved. He walked down the hallway, past the sitting bodies, to the front entrance of the ranger office. He opened the outer door, a violation of blackout protocol, and stood on the step and listened. Not to the baby, to the dark. I followed him. The pre-dawn air was brittle with frost. The tree line was invisible, but I knew where the dead stood because I'd watched them take their positions for 3 consecutive nights. "Can you hear it out here?" I asked. Curtis held up a hand. We stood for 10 seconds, 20. The cry from inside was faint at this distance, muffled by walls and doors and insulation. A whisper. Less. "Marginal," Curtis said. "Winds from the west, carrying it down slope. Toward the valley, toward the line. It might hold, he said. If she gets the feeding response inside 2 minutes, if the wind doesn't shift. He paused. Too many ifs. I looked at him. You could say we told you so. Curtis shook his head slowly. I never wanted to be right about this, Elliot. I wanted to be wrong. Being right means we're in danger. Nobody wins that. He stepped back inside and closed the door with the care of a man sealing an airlock. Inside the quiet room, the crying softened, then stopped. Francine had gotten the baby to latch. I heard Marcus exhale through the wall, a sound so relieved it was almost a sob. Dara appeared beside me in the hallway. Boy or girl? I don't know yet. Go find out. I knocked. Francine opened the door 6 inches. Behind her, Yolanda was propped against the wall, gray-faced and trembling, with a bundle against her chest that was so small it didn't look like a person yet. Marcus was crouched beside her, fingers on her wrist, counting her pulse. It's a boy, Francine said. 6 pounds, roughly. Breathing well. Apgar is probably a 7. Yolanda lost more blood than I'd like. What do you need? Clean water, as much as you can heat, and the flashlight from Marcus's kit, the pen light. I need to check the baby's reflexes. I got the water. I got the pen light. I stood in the doorway and looked at the child, who was now silent against Yolanda's skin, eyes closed, mouth working slightly in that reflexive nursing motion that newborns make even in sleep. He was red and wrinkled, and his head was slightly conical from the birth, and he was, without question, the most important thing that had happened on this ridge in 6 months. I went back outside. Dawn was breaking in a thin gray line over the eastern ridge. I walked to the overlook and raised the binoculars. The tree line was empty. I scanned left to right to left. Nothing. The 31 figures that had held their positions for 3 days were gone. Not retreated, gone. The slope was bare. The valley fog was lifting and I could see a half-mile down the grade, and there was nothing moving. I lowered the binoculars and felt something shift in my chest that I didn't trust yet. Hope was the most dangerous feeling at Ridgeline. It made you careless. It made you extend a calculation past the available data. But the tree line was empty, and the baby was alive. And for the first time in 6 months, the arithmetic of this place included addition. The boy was 3 days old when the first people from outside arrived. There were 4 of them, a man, 2 women, and a child of about 10. They appeared at the south gate at midday, on foot, carrying nothing but a single backpack and a tire iron. The man was limping. One of the women had a wound on her forearm, wrapped in a strip of bedsheet. Gate protocol was Dara's jurisdiction, and Dara's gate protocol was absolute. No admissions without quarantine. Any new arrival waited 24 hours in the vehicle bay, separate from the general population under observation for fever, behavioral irregularity, or bite concealment. No exceptions. Marcus conducted the intake exam. Curtis logged the names and origins. The system had admitted 11 people over 6 months and rejected 2, both of whom had refused to submit to the medical check and had been turned away with 3 days of food and a direction. But these 4 hadn't found Ridgeline by accident. We heard the baby, the man said. His name was Dale Witherow, 38, formerly a machinist in Waynesboro, 61 miles south. He'd been walking for 9 days. 3 nights ago, we were on the ridge to the west, maybe 2 miles, middle of the night. Thought we were hearing things. Then it came again. My daughter said it was a baby. His daughter was the 10-year-old, a serious-eyed girl named Rosalie, who stood beside him with her hands in her jacket pockets and said nothing. "Sound carries up here," Curtis said from behind Dara's shoulder. His tone was neutral. His eyes were not. "We followed it," Dale continued. "Figured anywhere a baby was alive, there were people. People with walls and food and a reason to be staying put." He looked at the fence, the buildings, the smoke-free compound. "We were right." Dara admitted them to quarantine. Marcus examined them. The woman with the arm wound, her name was Janelle, had a laceration from a car door edge, not a bite. She was clean. They were all clean. They emerged from quarantine 24 hours later, and the camp's population rose to 57. Then 59. A couple from Staunton who'd heard the same cry from a different ridge. Then 61. A teenage boy alone with a hunting rifle who'd been living in a gas station for 3 months and had followed the sound for a day and a half. Then 64. Then 68. The baby's cry, which Curtis had calculated as a perimeter threat, was functioning as a beacon. Not for the dead, the tree line remained empty, the valley clusters dissipating rather than consolidating, but for the living. People heard it the way you hear a bell across water. It traveled the ridgeline corridors and the thermal updrafts, and it landed in the ears of people who had been silent so long they'd forgotten that human sound meant human life. Curtis recalculated. I watched him do it. He sat in the dining hall one evening with his ledger and his pen and worked the numbers for an hour. And when he was done, he walked to Dara's office and presented a revised projection. "We can sustain 90, he said, "with expanded scavenging and the spring water. Maybe 100 if we terrace the south slope for growing by spring." Dara stared at him. "You wanted her outside the wire." "I was wrong." Curtis said it without inflection, without drama, the way he said everything. A datum corrected, a ledger updated. The beacon effect outweighs the sound risk. The dead aren't responding to the frequency. The living are. Every person who arrives is a new laborer, a new skill set, a new pair of hands on the fence. The baby is a net asset. Don't call him an asset, Curtis. Strategically, he is. Dara took the revised projection and pinned it to the wall beside the original memo. She didn't say anything about irony. Dara didn't deal in irony. She dealt in binders and protocols and the slow grinding forward motion of organized survival. The baby's name was Ezra. Yolanda named him on the second day. I don't know where the name came from. I didn't ask. It was hers to give, and she gave it. I carved a small sign, not a grave cross, a different shape, just a flat plank, and burned Ezra into the wood with a soldering iron. I hung it on the quiet room door. Francine saw it and said nothing. But that evening, she moved the shelf of offerings, the booties, the rattle, the knitted cap from inside the room to a table in the hallway, visible to everyone who passed. The shrine. That was what people started calling it. The first thing at Ridgeline that faced forward. I need to tell you about the night everything almost ended, because the story doesn't earn its warmth unless you understand how close we came to losing it. Day 18 after Ezra's birth. Population 71. The weather had turned, a cold front dropping temperatures to single digits, and the wind swung northeast, pushing sound down slope for the first time since the birth. The North Slope Watch reported movement at the tree line at 9 p.m. Not the slow lateral drift I'd observed before the birth. Direct uphill approach, fast by infected standards. Dara ordered full blackout, lanterns extinguished. The generator, a portable unit we ran for 2 hours each evening to charge batteries, was shut down mid-cycle. The camp went dark and silent in under 4 minutes, which was good, which was practiced, which was the muscle memory of 6 months of Dara's discipline. But Ezra was 18 days old, and at 9:14 he woke hungry. The cry split the dark like a fracture in glass. Francine was beside him immediately. I could hear her moving through the wall, the creak of the cot, the whispered coaching, but 18-day-old babies don't negotiate. He screamed. A full-throated, open-mouthed, red-faced howl that bounced off the padded walls and leaked through every seam. In the hallway, nobody moved. I was at the junction between the ranger office and the vehicle bay, brush axe in hand. And I could see Curtis at the far end of the corridor, illuminated by nothing, a shadow among shadows. Between us, the hallway was packed with people sitting against the walls, knees up, hands over mouths, some of them pressing their palms against their ears, not to block the sound, but to hold themselves together. From outside, a noise. Low, resonant. A collective moan that rose from the north slope like wind through a pipe organ. Except it wasn't wind. It was mouths. Dozens of them. Responding to the cry. Dara appeared beside me. North fence. How long? Depends on how many and how fast. 10 minutes, maybe less. Can we suppress the crying? Francine's trying. The moaning grew louder. I could feel it in the floor now, a vibration that meant bodies pressing against the outer fence, the chain link absorbing impact. In the quiet room, Ezra was still screaming. Curtis moved. He didn't come toward us. He went the other direction, toward the vehicle bay. I heard the steel door open. I heard him step outside. Curtis, Dara started. Then a sound from outside that didn't belong. A sharp, rhythmic banging metal on metal coming from the south end of the compound. Curtis, hitting something against the vehicle bay wall. Deliberately. A counter signal. Louder than the baby. Closer to the fence. Drawing attention from the south, away from the ranger office, away from the quiet room. The moaning shifted direction. I heard it migrate. A wave of sound rolling south around the compound perimeter like water finding a new channel. Curtis kept banging. The rhythm was steady, mechanical, insistent, a man converting himself into a decoy with nothing but a wrench and a wall. From the quiet room, the crying stopped. Francine had gotten Ezra to latch. Curtis kept banging for another 40 seconds, then stopped. The silence that followed was the most absolute silence I'd ever heard at Ridgeline, not enforced, not disciplined, but the silence of 60-odd people holding their collective breath while the dead decided which sound to follow. 10 seconds, 20, a minute. The moaning faded. Not immediately, gradually. Like a tide retreating down a long, flat beach, each wave slightly quieter than the last, until the only sound was the wind in the fence wire and the blood in my own ears. Curtis came back inside. He closed the steel door. His hands were shaking. He walked past me without stopping and sat down on the floor of the hallway and put his forehead on his knees. I sat down beside him. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the last 2 minutes hadn't already said. The man who'd proposed exile had just painted himself as a target to protect the child he'd tried to remove. I don't think it was redemption. I think it was something simpler. Curtis had lived inside his calculations for 6 months. And when the calculation said the child was the asset and he was the expendable variable, he'd acted on it with the same rigor he brought to everything. Your hands, I said. He lifted them. Bloody. The wrench had torn his palms. Marcus, I called, whispering. Marcus came. He bandaged Curtis's hands without comment. When he was finished, Curtis stood up, walked to his bunk, and lay down. By morning, he was organizing the next scavenging run, palms wrapped in gauze, writing notes with a pen held between his fingertips. The attack, if you could call a mindless uphill migration an attack, had consequences that outlasted the night. 7 sections of the north fence were bowed inward. 2 cattle panels had popped their wire ties and hung at angles that wouldn't resist a second push. The razor wire along the top rail was compressed flat in 3 places. Curtis assigned a repair priority list. Dara approved it. The work began at dawn and continued for 4 days, every able body on the fence, lashing new wire, driving new stakes, reinforcing the posts with scavenged steel pipe we'd been hoarding for exactly this purpose. But the real consequence was political. The night had proven both factions right simultaneously. Curtis was right that the baby's cry attracted the dead. Dara was right that the baby's presence had drawn enough new hands to mount a defense. The equations coexisted and could not be collapsed into a single answer. And the camp had to find a way to live inside that ambiguity. Dara proposed what she called the protocol revision. Not a new vote, a structural change. Ridgeline would operate on a dual-track system, silent running as default, with designated sound response windows. 3 times daily dawn, midday, dusk, the camp would tolerate normal noise levels for 30 minutes. Cooking, conversation, infant care, tool use. Outside those windows, silence discipline held. The logic was behavioral. Condition the dead to associate the ridge with periodic sound that moved and varied, rather than continuous silence broken by sudden cries. Make the noise expected and survivable, rather than rare and terrifying. Curtis endorsed it. He wrote the schedule. He posted it in the dining hall. Under the schedule, in his needle handwriting, he added a line I stared at for a long time. Ezra is noise. Noise is life. Calibrate accordingly. The first sound window opened on a Friday at dawn, and for the first time in 6 months, people spoke above a whisper during daylight hours. The effect was physical. I watched Bev Tanaka's shoulders drop 3 inches. I watched Delia Marsh laugh, at something Francine said about a dropped spoon, and the sound was so foreign that 2 people nearby flinched before they smiled. Ezra, oblivious to the policy that orbited him, slept through the first sound window entirely. Yolanda held him in the dining hall, while Francine sat beside her eating oatmeal. And the camp moved around them with a tenderness that was almost unbearable to watch. People slowed down when they passed the baby. Not to look at him, they looked, of course, everyone looked, but because proximity to a newborn imposed a physical gentleness that reminded them of a tempo they'd been living at before the world turned. I noticed something else during those weeks. The graveyard slowed. Plot 35 didn't come until day 26 after Ezra's birth, the longest interval between burials since Ridgeline began. It was an elderly man named Walter Shawn, 81, who died in his sleep of what Marcus called simply age. Not infection, not injury, not despair. Just a body that had reached its limit and set itself down. I dug Walter Shawn's grave with a strange feeling in my hands. Not grief I'd burned through performative grief by plot 10 and genuine grief by plot 20, and was now operating in a professional register that was closer to carpentry than mourning. The strange feeling was proportion. 1 burial in 26 days, after a pace of 1 every 9. The math that I'd offered in the vehicle bay where dying was shifting, and I could feel it in the dirt. When I finished Walter's cross and drove it into the ground, I stood at the foot of his grave and counted the plots again. 35 dead, 71 living. The ratio had reversed. not because fewer people were dying, one was still one, but because the living count was climbing. Ezra's beacon had brought 20 new bodies through the gate, and each one was breathing, working, building, eating, and not requiring a hole in the earth. I thought about Curtis's ledger. I thought about my own ledger, the Gideon Bible with its 35 names. Curtis counted the living. I counted the dead. Between us, we held the entire population of Ridgeline, past and present, in 2 different accounts written in 2 different hands. That was the first time I understood that the camp didn't need to choose between us. It needed both books open. At week 6, the first group of arrivals brought a piece of information that redefined everything. There were 9 of them, the largest single group to reach Ridgeline, led by a woman named Adrienne Polk, a former Army logistics sergeant who'd spent the 6 months since the outbreak organizing a mobile supply column out of Charlottesville. They'd been moving north along the Blue Ridge, mapping settlements, trading goods, carrying news. Adrienne was compact, sun-browned, and possessed a command presence that made Dara straighten visibly when they shook hands at the gate. She submitted to quarantine without objection, answered Marcus's medical questions with serial number precision, and on the second day of observation, she asked to speak to whoever was in charge. "That's complicated," Dara said. "It always is. Who makes decisions?" "I coordinate. Curtis Lamb runs logistics. Elliot Varsa maintains the cemetery and the external perimeter." Adrienne looked at me with the evaluating gaze of someone accustomed to unit composition. "The gravedigger has a seat at the table?" "The gravedigger reminds us what we're counting," Dara said. Adrienne accepted this without comment. She laid out a hand-drawn map on the dining hall table, weighted the corners with cans, and gave us the only briefing any of us had received in 6 months. The picture was worse than we'd known and better than we'd feared. The eastern seaboard was functionally collapsed from Virginia to Maine. Federal continuity of government sites existed but were non-communicative. Military units were fragmented into regional commands with no central coordination. Most civilian settlements were smaller than Ridgeline and less organized. Several had failed overrun, starved, or fractured by internal conflict. But, and this was the word Adrienne used, a deliberate but placed like a structural support beneath the weight of what she'd just described, a network was forming. Settlement-to-settlement communication via hand-crank radio. Trading routes along defensible ridge lines. A shared lexicon of signal codes. A loose coalition that Adrienne called the Ridgeline Relay. Mapping habitable points like stars in a constellation nobody could see yet from the ground. "You're the 14th settlement I've logged," she said. "You have the highest population, the best defensive position, and the only confirmed birth." That word, birth, landed on the table like a dropped stone. Adrienne, this looked at Dara, then at Curtis, then at me. "Do you understand what that means?" "It means we have a baby," Dara said. "It means you have proof. Every settlement I visited is in decline. Attrition, age, injury, despair. The math goes one direction. People survive, but they don't believe they're going to last. They're holding on, not building. And the difference between holding on and building is whether you think there's a future." She tapped the map. A baby is a future. A verified birth in a defended settlement is not a demographic event. It's a signal. It tells every person on this ridge that the species isn't finished. Curtis leaned forward. "You want to broadcast it?" "I want to register it. Add it to the relay. Let the other settlements know. Not as propaganda, as data. A living child, born healthy, in a functioning community. That's the most important piece of information in this corridor." Dara looked at me. I don't know why. Maybe because the gravedigger was the one who'd argued that the dying needed to be counted. And now someone was arguing that the living needed to be announced. Yolanda decides, I said. He's her son. Adrienne nodded. Fair. Yolanda decided that evening. Francine brought the question to her in the quiet room, and Yolanda answered in under a minute. Tell them, she said. Tell them his name. The broadcast went out on a Wednesday at noon, during the designated sound window, from the hand-crank radio in the vehicle bay. Adrienne composed the message in the relay's coded format. Settlement identifier, coordinates, population count, defensive status, resource inventory. At the end, one additional line. Confirmed live birth, male, Ezra Reese, day 1, mother and child healthy. 3 settlements acknowledged within the hour. By evening, 7. Each acknowledgement was a crackle of static and a coded reply, impersonal and procedural. But Dara's hands shook as she logged them. 7 points of light responding to a single name. A constellation beginning to resolve. Over the following weeks, Ridgeline changed in ways that were visible but difficult to articulate. The settlement didn't suddenly become joyful or hopeful or any of the large words that people use to describe transformation. It became oriented. That's the closest I can get. For 6 months, every action at Ridgeline had been rearward facing. Defense, rationing, patching, burying. Now there were actions that faced forward. Bev Tanaka tanned a hide and cut it into strips for hanging drying racks, because someone would need to preserve food past this winter and into the next. Curtis mapped the south slope for spring terracing, because someone would need to grow food beyond the salvage horizon. Marcus began training Janelle in basic wound care, because someone would need a second medic when Marcus was gone. The word someone had changed. It used to mean whoever is left. Now it meant Ezra's generation. A single infant had converted an abstraction into a person, and the person was asleep in the quiet room with his fist in his mouth. I kept digging graves. Plot 36 came in January, an older woman named Haiwan Park, who died of what Marcus believed was a stroke. Plot 37 in February, a man from Adrienne's group, taken by pneumonia. The pace was slower, the intervals were longer, but the dead kept coming, as they always do, and I kept opening the earth to receive them. I also did something I hadn't done before. I started carving birth markers, not crosses, different shapes, flat rounds, like the sign I'd hung on the quiet room door. Ezra Reese, and below it, the date. I placed it at the head of the graveyard, facing the opposite direction from the crosses, not toward the dead, but toward the camp. Dale Witherow's daughter, Rosalie, came to watch me carve it. She stood 4 feet away with her hands in her pockets and observed without speaking for 10 minutes. Then she said, "Why are the grave ones facing that way, and the baby one facing this way?" I hadn't thought about it consciously, but when she asked, the answer was already there. "Because these people are looking back at where they came from," I said, touching a cross. "And this one is looking at where he's going." Rosalie considered this. "What about the people who are alive but aren't babies?" "I think we're supposed to decide which direction we're facing." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and walked back to camp. I stood in the graveyard and looked at the 2 sets of markers, 37 crosses facing the valley, 1 round facing the ridge, and I understood something that I'd been circling for months without landing on. The graveyard wasn't separate from the camp. It was the camp's memory. Every cross was a vote that had already been cast for survival, because each person buried here had survived long enough to be known and named and mourned. They were not the failure of Ridgeline. They were its foundation. The baby was not the opposite of the graves. He was their continuation. Curtis would have called that sentiment. Maybe it was. But I held it anyway, the way you hold a tool you've learned to trust, even when you can't explain the engineering. Spring came early that year. By March, the South Slope terracing was underway. By April, seeds were in the ground. Heirloom tomato, snap pea, winter squash from a cache Adrienne's column had traded 3 boxes of ammunition for. By May, the perimeter had been expanded 30 yards to enclose a new water collection system fed by roof runoff and filtered through gravel beds Curtis had designed. Ezra was 4 months old and gaining weight. He was not a quiet baby. He vocalized freely during sound windows and fussed at night in a way that Francine managed with an efficiency that amazed me. The dead in the valley had thinned. Whether they'd migrated, decayed, or simply spent themselves against the lower elevations, the overlook showed fewer shapes each week. Marcus cautioned against reading too much into it. Dara agreed. Curtis logged the counts and said nothing. I logged them too, in my Bible. Next to the names of the dead, I started writing the names of the living. Not a census, Curtis had that, but a parallel account. 2 columns, one for the graves I'd dug, one for the people I'd watched arrive, be examined, be admitted, and be fed. 2 books, both open. The last thing I want to tell you happened on a morning in early June, 7 months after the outbreak and 6 weeks after Ezra's birth. I was in the graveyard at dawn, not digging, just standing. The light was coming up copper and gold over the eastern ridge, and the valley below was green in a way that felt like an accusation, as if the earth had decided to keep going regardless of what we'd done to the arrangements on its surface. I had the Bible in my hand, and I was reading the names. Both columns, the dead and the living, side by side in my own handwriting, which had gotten smaller as the pages filled. Yolanda found me there. She was carrying Ezra against her chest in a sling Bev had stitched from canvas. He was awake, making the soft grunting sounds that Francine called organizing, which apparently meant his nervous system was sorting itself out. Yolanda didn't speak. She walked along the rows of crosses the way you walk through a church slowly, reading each name, pausing at some, moving past others. She stopped at Aaron Varela's cross, the 19-year-old biology student, the one who'd wanted to study whales. "Did you know her?" Yolanda asked. "A little. She was kind." "That's enough." She touched the cross with her free hand. "That's enough to be remembered by." She continued down the row. I watched her and the baby move through my graveyard, and I realized that this was the first time a child had been among the dead at Ridgeline. Not to mourn, not to learn, just to be present. Ezra would not remember this walk. He would not remember the crosses or the names or the copper light. But he had been here, and that meant the graveyard was no longer a place only for ending. When Yolanda reached the far end of the row, she turned and looked at me across the 37 crosses. Ezra shifted against her chest. She adjusted the sling with one hand, a gesture so practiced it was already muscle memory. Already old, already maternal in the geological sense of a word that contains the whole history of continuation. "Elliot," she said, "thank you for digging them." I didn't know how to answer that. Nobody thanks the gravedigger. You avoid the gravedigger. You speak to him only when necessary, and you leave his corner of the camp alone, because his work reminds you of the thing you're trying to outlive. "I'll keep doing it," I said. "I know." She paused. "But maybe not only that. Maybe you could carve some more of those round ones, too, for the people who come." I looked at the single birth marker at the head of the row. Ezra Reese. Facing the camp, facing forward. I could do that, I said. She nodded and walked back toward the ranger office. Ezra's head a small, warm shape against her collarbone. I watched them go. Then I turned to the tool shed and pulled out a fresh plank and the soldering iron and sat down on the stack of fence posts that Dara had once used as a bench to tell me about Curtis's memo. I burned a name into the wood. Not Ezra's this time. Mine. Elliot Vars. Not a grave marker, an arrival marker. The same round shape, facing the same direction. I drove it into the ground at the head of the second row. Then I made another. Dara Kessling, and another. Curtis Lamb, and another. Marcus Healy, and Francine, and Bev Tanaka, and Dale Witherow. I made them all afternoon. 53 originals, and every arrival since. Each one a flat round of wood with a name and a date. The date, not of death, but of the day they'd come to Ridgeline. I lined them up in a second plot, parallel to the graveyard, facing opposite. By evening, the two plots mirrored each other. The dead facing the valley, the living facing the ridge. Between them, a path of bare grass where I walked every morning. Curtis came to inspect at dusk. He stood at the entrance to the living plot and looked at the rows. His bandaged hands hung at his sides. He found his own marker and read it. "You put my arrival date wrong," he said. "It was Tuesday the 11th, not Wednesday." I looked at him. "Is that all you have to say?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the two fields, the crosses and the rounds, the dead and the living. "The arithmetic changed," he said. "Yeah. It was supposed to." The closest Curtis Lamb had ever come to wonder. He straightened his marker by 1 degree and walked back to camp. I stayed until dark. The spring air was warm and smelled like turned earth and new grass. From the quiet room, faintly, through the evening's final sound window, I could hear Ezra crying not in distress, just in existence, just in the daily practice of being alive and needing something and trusting that the need would be answered. I listened to it carry across the ridge and down toward the valley where the dead had been, and where the green was growing back over whatever they'd left behind. I still dig graves. Plot 41 came last week, and there will be a 42, and the earth doesn't keep a ledger of when it's supposed to stop receiving. But I carve the round markers too. Every arrival, every birth there have been 2 more since Ezra. And the quiet room isn't quiet anymore. It's the loudest room in camp, and Dara lets it be. I keep both books. The Bible with its 2 columns is nearly full now. I'll need a second volume soon, and I've asked Adrian's next supply run to look for one. Curtis says a blank notebook would be more practical. He's right. I'll use the Bible anyway. The graveyard and the arrival field face each other across 6 feet of grass. I walk between them every morning before breakfast. I read the names, all of them, the dead who made the ground, the living who stand on it. And one round marker, the first, smaller than the rest, that started everything, Ezra Reese. He is 8 months old. He is learning to sit up by himself. He will never know a world before the outbreak, which means he will never grieve one. His first word, Francine insists, will be important. Yolanda says it doesn't matter. I think it already happened. That first cry, the one that split the silence and drew the dead and drew the living and broke the arithmetic open, that was his first word. It meant, "I'm here," we answered.